People assume imposter syndrome is about not being good enough. But for a lot of bisexual people, it has nothing to do with confidence. It begins with a much quieter question. What if I'm wrong about myself? That question doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it slips into your mind after someone says, "You're just confused," or after an ex tells you that you're basically straight, or basically gay, or after you realize you've started explaining your identity before anyone even asked. You notice something strange. You're not just living your life anymore. You're constantly checking whether your own feelings qualify as evidence, as if your identity has to pass another test. Again and again. Most people think bisexual imposter syndrome is about doubting your sexuality. But that's only the surface. The deeper problem is that you slowly stop trusting your own internal experience. You begin treating your emotions like unreliable witnesses. Every attraction gets investigated. Every relationship becomes a piece of evidence. Every crush becomes another courtroom. And somehow, you're always the one on trial. That's exhausting, because the people around you often see certainty as authenticity. If you're certain, you're believed. If you're complicated, you're questioned. So you start wondering if certainty is something you're supposed to perform, not something you naturally feel. You might notice yourself thinking things like, if I date someone of a different gender, people will assume the last relationship wasn't real. If I date someone of the same gender, they'll say I've finally picked a side. No matter what happens, someone else always seems ready to rewrite your story. Eventually, you begin helping them. Without realizing it, you censor details. You simplify your experiences. You leave parts out because they're harder to explain. Not because they're untrue, because you're tired. Tired of watching every conversation become an interrogation disguised as curiosity. People ask questions they would never ask anyone else. How do you know? When did you decide? Are you sure? Maybe it's just a phase. At first, you answer patiently, then carefully, then defensively. Eventually, you start asking yourself the same questions before anyone else has the chance. That's when something changes. The loudest critic isn't outside anymore. It's inside. And that's the part people rarely talk about. Real imposter syndrome isn't always hearing someone else's voice. Sometimes it's realizing their voice became yours. You don't wake up one morning and decide to doubt yourself. Your brain simply adapts. It learns that certainty gets rewarded. Complexity gets challenged. So it starts searching for certainty everywhere, even where certainty doesn't naturally exist, especially in identity, because uncertainty feels dangerous when you've spent years being treated like uncertainty means you're not real. Modern culture doesn't make this easier. Everything wants quick labels. Dating apps, algorithms, social media. People scroll through identities the same way they scroll through profiles. Fast, simple, immediately understandable. Ambiguity doesn't perform well. Complexity isn't algorithm-friendly. And bisexuality often exists inside complexity. Not confusion. Complexity. Those aren't the same thing. Confusion means you don't know. Complexity means your reality doesn't fit into someone else's expectation. There's a difference. A huge one. But when the world keeps rewarding simplified versions of people, you slowly become tempted to simplify yourself. Not because it's authentic, because it's easier. You notice yourself editing stories before telling them, changing words, removing details, Trying to predict which version of yourself will require the fewest explanations. That's a survival strategy, not dishonesty. People often think masking only happens in workplaces or unsafe families. It also happens in ordinary conversations. Tiny moments. Someone asks who you're dating. You calculate. Someone assumes your orientation. You hesitate. Someone makes a joke. You smile even though something quietly tightened inside your chest. Nobody notices, because masking rarely looks dramatic. It looks socially successful. That's what makes it so dangerous. The better you become at making other people comfortable, the harder it becomes to notice how uncomfortable you've become with yourself. And then another pattern appears. You begin searching other bisexual people for permission to exist. You compare stories, compare timelines, compare attraction, compare experiences, as if there's a secret checklist everyone else received except you. There isn't. But comparison feels safer than trust when trust has been repeatedly interrupted. That's why so many people keep asking, what if I'm not bisexual enough? Notice the wording. Not, what am I feeling? But, am I enough? The question stopped being about attraction. It became about legitimacy. And legitimacy is a dangerous thing to chase because it usually depends on someone else's approval. The finish line keeps moving. One person says you've dated too many men. Another says you've dated too many women. Someone else says you need more experience. Someone else says your experience doesn't count. If your identity depends on satisfying everyone else's definition, you'll spend your entire life auditioning for a role you already live. That's what imposter syndrome steals first. Not confidence. Trust. Trust in your own inner life. Trust that your feelings can exist before they're validated. Trust that attraction doesn't become real only after somebody else agrees with it. And once that trust disappears, you begin monitoring yourself constantly, not because you're dishonest, because you're afraid of accidentally lying without realizing it. That's a terrifying way to live, always investigating yourself, always collecting evidence, always wondering if tomorrow's feelings will invalidate yesterday's truth. Very few people realize how lonely that becomes. Because loneliness isn't only about being alone. Sometimes it's about feeling like nobody, including you, fully believes your own experience.